So let's talk about Ben Jonson. So Jonson was a kind of reversal of the period in strange ways, meaning while most converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, Jonson went the other way. He had a very colorful life. He was guilty of manslaughter. He found refuge in a church and wasn't killed. He had a tattoo on his thumb, which just indicated to further law enforcement officers, as it were, that is the servants of the Queen and later the King, that if Jonson committed another murder, he would be dealt with appropriately. Um, Jonson had his own poetic school. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. Meaning he was very influential in his time and he really understood himself as opposed to John Donne. We'll talk again about that in a second. But we want to really look at his poem to Penshurst because it provides a visual representation of the passage that we saw in Shakespeare. And also, let's just look for John Dee and his version of the spheres. Let's see if we get John Dee here images. Should be, let's see, John Dee was an alchemist, and he had many illustrations, like, kind of like the one we saw here, the celestial orbs, this idea of the world as a complete and coherent place. We saw images like this. Jonson, in his poem, really provides, as I said, a kind of verbal version of this, or a written or poetic version of this. And this poem, it's important to note, is in the history of country house poems. It comes, I think, from Rome. Yes, poems about a house. And this house is not just any old house. It's the house of Sir Robert Sidney, the uncle of Sir Philip Sidney, the most powerful Protestant family, or one of them, in England. Robert was a ally of King James, as we'll see very clearly from this poem. So the poem is about a house, but it's really about the person who owns the house. And in some sense, it's, I think, a kind of interesting and productive way of looking at this is Jonson's version of Achilles' shield. That is, this is the Elizabethan version of the shield of Achilles. And what I mean by that, in Homer's Iliad, the shield of Achilles shows the whole world. And so also in this house, we see Jonson's world. Homer is interested in different things than Jonson, but we'll see through the focus on the house that Jonson is looking at this place as a microcosm, as a little world that represents everything outside of it. We should also point out that during this period, poets did not have they couldn't apply for grants. There was no national endowment for the arts or anything like that, so they had to seek out patrons. And Jonson seeks out the patronage of Robert Sidney, and we'll see what Sidney gets out of it. I mean, Sidney gets out of it a poem about his house, but more than that. Jonson starts out this poem, and we'll just read through it, by distinguishing this place from other kinds of houses that are being built at the same time. Jonson is most known as a playwright, and in his plays, he satirizes the greed of this new culture of individualism, scammers, people just with bad motivations, really acting in a predatory way in relationship to their surroundings. And the thing about Jonson, which is so interesting, is that he embraces the Catholicism of the past. He satirizes rampant individualism, but Jonson himself, he knew which way the wind was blowing. And under James, he became England's first national poet. It's called a poet laureate. Israel probably has a version. America has a version of it. But more than that, Jonson published his own writings, the complete works of Ben Jonson. It was chutzpah, just you should know this, right? Jonson treats himself like a classic. It wasn't until after Shakespeare died. Jonson's, I think the edition of Jonson was 1613. Shakespeare's editors, Hemmings and Condell, I think, they decided in 1621 to publish the complete works of Shakespeare. And that itself was a move to try to canonize Shakespeare as a great author, meaning we have our collection of Virgil, of Homer. Here is the English classic. So Jonson, extremely complicated figure, really negotiating the tensions that are present in Elizabethan England, later in James's England. So let's read this poem. Thou art not Penshurst built to envious show. It's vocative, it's calling out to the house of touch or marble, nor canst boast a row of polished pillars or a roof of gold. You're not a show off. This house is not. Lo, thou hast no lantern, whereof tales are told, trysts outside, or stairs or courts, meaning illicit gatherings, but standest an ancient pile, meaning men and women. And these grudge that art reverenced the while. Thou, this is to Penshurst, joyest in better marks of soil, of air, of wood, of water, not the four elements, but very close to what we saw in Hooker. Therein thou art fair, meaning the elements. And notice now that Jonson is giving this place a kind of classical setting. Thou hast thy walks for health as well as sport, thy mount to which the Dryads do resort, where Pan and Bacchus their high feasts have made. This place is saturated in the classics. Beneath the broad beech and the chestnut shade. It's also, there's obviously pastoral echoes here as well. That taller tree, which of a nut was said, a nut tree, at his great birth, I think Sydney, where all the muses met. The muses are present in this house. There in the writhed bark are cut the names of many a sylvan taken with his flames, just like Orlando and As You Like It carves Rosalind's name into trees. There are sylvans, pastoral lovers, who are carving the names of their lovers into trees. The lighter fawns to reach the lady's oak, the copse too named of gamage. What's a copse here? I'm pleading ignorance here. Copse. Whoopsie. A copse. Oh, look, that's a copse. It looks like a certain kind of landscape here. A copse is a small group of trees. There we go. Thy copse too named of gamage thou hast there, that never fails to serve thee seasoned deer. This place serves up nature the food for man to consume, when thou wouldst feast or exercise thy friends. The lower land, that to the river bends, thy sheep, thy bullocks, kine, and calves do feed. The middle grounds, thy mares and horses breed. Very Homeric, right? The shield. Each band doth yield thee conies, little bunnies, and the tops fertile of wood ashore, and Sydney's copse more trees. To crown thy open table doth provide the purple pheasant and the speckled side. The painted partridge lies in every field, and for thy mess is willing to be killed. The painted partridge, these birds just say, oh, it's Thanksgiving, kill me, serve me. Again, this kind of fantasy of this utopian place where everything serves the center, which for the moment we'll see is Robert Sidney's estate. Not only that, and notice also the purple pheasant, the painted partridge. Jonson is just hinting a little bit here that, what you're seeing here is my creation. It's painted. It's the work of a creator, both God as creator and also poet as creator, who's painting this partridge for us. And if the high swollen Medway, another river, fail thy dish, thou hast thy ponds that pay thee tribute fish, fat, aged carps that run into thy net. Just a beautiful poetic line, so simple. And pikes, now weary their own kind to eat, as loath the second drought or cast to stay officiously at first themselves betray. You can look into this later. It seems a little bit like Donne's poem that, the natural world is betraying each other. Remember, we saw that in the bait. Bright eels that emulate them, imitate them, and leap on land before the fish or into his hand. Great, go fishing, it's not hard. Then hath thy orchard fruit. Is it orchard or orchard? Thy garden flowers, fresh as the air, and new as are the hours. The early cherry with the later plum, fig, grape, and quince, each in his time doth come. Everything in Jonson's world is very orderly, place and time. Fig, grape, and quince, each in his time doth come. The blushing apricot and woolly peach hang on thy walls, that every child may reach. And though thy walls be of the country stone, they're reared with no man's ruin, no man's groan. This is, again, this fantasy of a world in which people work for other people, but not at their own expense, not tirelessly or working in a way that is degrading or shows their lower social status, but everybody is together in creating this world. There's none that dwell about them, wish them down. Nobody's jealous. So you see, this really is a fantasy. But all come in, the farmer and the clown. And now Jonson is shifting a little bit, and he's imagining a kind of pilgrimage to Robert Sidney where everybody comes and offers gifts that, of course, Sidney, like God in the Bible, in Chumash, in the five books of Moses, he doesn't need these things either, but they come as a way of offering tribute. But all come in, the flower and the farmer and the clown, and no one empty-handed to salute thy lord and lady, though they have no suit. Some bring a capon, little chicken, some a rural cake, some nuts, some apples, some that think they make the better cheeses bring them, or else send by their ripe daughters, Jonson comparing women to fruit. We can talk about that in a second. I mean, it's part of Jonson's fantasy here, this hierarchy, whom they would commend this way to husbands. And this is significant, and we can put the gender issue aside if we can for the moment, and whose baskets bear an emblem of themselves in plum or pear. So what's important here is Jonson imagines a world in which the things that people make are imprinted with the person themselves. So the pie is not just a pie. It's like when you give a really good gift to somebody, and it's a really good gift because you see their knowledge of you, or you see them in the present that they give. And these presents are emblems. They're to be read. And they're read as, again, she made this. And Jonson, in the same way, we'll see more of this later, is saying, I made this poem. An emblem, again, is a thing to be read. But what can this, more than express their love, add to thy free provisions far above the need of such? You don't need any of this stuff. Whose liberal board doth flow with all that hospitality doth know. Think of Downton Abbey, right? They're just tons of food, chef abundance, where comes no guest but is allowed to eat without his fear. And thy lord's own meat, not just the cheap stuff, where the same beer and bread and self same wine, this is his lordship's, shall also be mine. Jonson puts himself in the center of this poem. And I, not fain to sit as some this day at great men's tables, I'm not afraid to sit with Sidney, and yet dine away. Others are, but I just sit at his table and eat. Here no man tells my cups. They don't count how much he's drinking, and Jonson was a notorious drinker and drunkard. Nor standing by, a waiter doth my gluttony envy, but gives me what I call and lets me eat. Another Coke, please. He knows below he shall find plenty of meat. Again, think Downton Abbey, the help eats downstairs. The tables hoard not up for the next day, probably some kind of reference to the to the manna in Numbers in the Bible. Nor when I take my lodging, how many times does Jonson say I in this poem? Need I pray for fire or lights or livery? All is there. Here I'll mention that in contrast to Jonson's country house poem, where all is there, total abundance, there's an earlier poem by Amelia Lanier called To Cook Him, which is also a country house poem, and it's gendered as feminine, and instead of there being abundance, there is lack. This is an interesting poem for many reasons, but it does introduce us to this genre, which others will manipulate, like Amelia Lanier, writing a very, very different poem. As if then, nor when I take my lodging, need I pray for fire or lights or livery, all is there, as if thou then wert mine, or I reigned here. Jonson is essentially saying, I do reign here. And the reason he reigns here is he's creating this world for Robert Sidney. I asked before, well, what does Sidney get out of this? Well, he gets this poem. And just as Jonson needed patrons, Sidney needs poets like Jonson to write an emblem, Penshurst, about Penshurst, of him, because it increases his status, obviously. It's like Jonson is his personal advertising agency. There's nothing I can wish for which I stay. That Jonson's being cute here. The antecedent of that is the house. That found King James when, hunting late this way with his brave son, Charles, the prince, the later king, they saw thy fires shine great on every hearth, as the desires of the Penates, I think these are Roman household gods, had been set on flame to entertain them. Or the country came with all their zeal to warm their welcome here. What, great I will not say, but sudden cheer, hurrah, didst thou then make him? And what praise was heaped on thy good lady then, who therein reaped the just reward of her high housewifery? So the feminine does appear in this poem. She's celebrated for her high housewifery. What does that mean? To have her linen plate and all things nigh when she was far. She's not even home. And not a room but dressed as if it had expected such a guest. So the feminine is present, but really absent. And as importantly, again, the gender issues are prominent here. But what's also important is that this room has to be here, not a room but dressed as if it had expected such a guest. And of course, it does expect a guest. There has to be a place in this house for Charles. I said, for James. I said before that this poem is about Sidney and his authority, but Sidney's authority comes from James, the king. That's why there has to be a place in his house, in Sidney's house for the king, as if it had expected such a guest. Again, the microcosm of the whole world. These, Penshurst, are they praise, and yet not all, there's more. The lady, thy lady's noble fruit, chaste with all. His children thy great lord may call his own. He's no suspect about who his kids might be or not be. A fortune in this age, but rarely known. Jonson does give us a sense of this was an age of real change and transition and individualism. And Jonson looks at this older world, Sidney, king, and will see God as a protection against those energies that are tearing, from Jonson's point of view, society apart. They are and have been taught religion. Sidney, James, God. Thence their gentler spirits have sucked innocence. Each morn and even they are taught to pray with the whole household, and may every day read in their virtuous parents' noble parts. Remember, we talked about reading before, reading in the emblem of the pie or the cake, reading in the emblem of the parents, the mysteries of manners, arms, and arts. These are not just people, but we read in them manners, civilized manners. Arms, I think, is the coat of arms, their family history, and arts. Now, Penshurst, they that will proportion thee with other edifices, other buildings. Anybody who wants to compare you with other buildings, when they see those proud, ambitious heaps, the kinds of stuff they build on, Eastern Long Island, East Hampton, Southampton, Amagansett, these giant, proud, ambitious heaps. I don't know where they do that in Israel, Caesarea maybe. Those proud, ambitious heaps and nothing else may say their lords have built, but thy Lord dwells. And Jonson gives this place, with that word dwells, the sense of permanence. So, as we were saying, Jonson is really creating this little world. It's a Johnsonian fantasy, and maybe just like we see Hooker in a sense, when Hooker says, if all the world were to fall apart, and then he gives us this sense of all the parts of the world. Hooker is worried, and he's earlier than Jonson, about a world that's falling apart. I think for Jonson, we feel it already is falling apart. And he is creating this memorial, this testimony to this older world, which is a praise of Robert Sidney as well. And when he says, as if I reign here, and he does, because he is the poet providing this, as I'm saying, this kind of public relations for Robert Sidney. And as we said, Jonson's Penshurst is a little world, a world that bespeaks the whole world outside of it. And as I said, it's kind of a testimony to a world where things are not already falling apart. We'll see in a contemporary poem by John Donne, Um, he writes, "All is lost, all coherence gone, the world is falling apart." Jonson and Donne don't have different versions of the world, but Jonson creates this testimony, this memorial for this world, this fantasy, which he creates. I said before that Jonson is his own poetic school. He writes a poem, I think, with the tribe of Ben in the title. And he looked at the tribe of Ben as those people who succeeded him. Most of them during the English Civil War were royalist poets, meaning they fought on behalf of the king, and you can see why. And you can see why he was the poet laureate for James, and later Charles. And Jonson produced special plays, they were called masques, for the king's palaces, in which the king and his family played a significant role. And you can see why, because it's a memorial not just to a house, but an entire world. And James and Charles probably didn't see it that way. They probably saw it as the world in which they governed. So we had just looked at this tradition of pastoral poetry, Marlowe, and then Raleigh, and then Donne. And we saw the way in which Donne shines a light or brings out a light that's not present, which she is taking obviously from the prophets, from the New Testament. Jonson's poetry doesn't show that light at all. There is the light of the Penates emanating from the house. But this poet has a little bit more to do with the tradition of Marlowe and Raleigh. I mean, obviously much, much more sophisticated and complicated. But we don't see any of the kinds of Dunnian images, what we saw as conceits, that take us out of the physical into something beyond it. This is really a testimony to the monumental character of the physical. And Jonson is much more part of that classical tradition. Donne is, of course, as well. But Donne's poems are Christian, and of course, Jonson was a devout Christian, a murderer as well. He was a devout Christian as well. But we don't see that poetic, that the presence of the infinite, the presence of something that can't be expressed outside of the poem. We don't find that in Jonson. It's true also, as we'll see, of Sidney to a certain extent, and also of Shakespeare and As You Like It, where pastoral plays a different kind of role. We'll talk about that. But there's nothing transcendent about this poem, except for the figures in it who claim political power, political place, king, prince. Their whole apparatus, which encompasses the natural world, the world of the classics, the king, the queen, children, God, it's all here. So this, as I said, if you want to think about, if you want a poem that really gives us a testimony of what that Elizabethan world picture looks like, well, here it is. But also between the lines, we feel the anxiety about that, because it's like the lady doth protest too much, the famous line in Hamlet. When something is affirmed so emphatically over and over again, you wonder there must be some doubts here. And this is, as we've been saying, a time of transition and a time of doubt. And Jonson is right in the middle. So we introduced ourselves to this idea of the microcosm, to the country house poem, to this new aesthetic, or an aesthetic that is also, I mean, I said similar to the classics to the pastoral of Marlowe and Raleigh, but it's also going to places that Marlowe and Raleigh could not have dreamed of. And again, the irony of this is that Jonson is so critical of this world of rampant individualism, but there he is, I, in the middle of this poem. Ben Jonson for you, people.